David Lee Roth, Van Halen's lead singer, his shiny black and red pants tightly sheathe his lower torso. He never would have made it onto the Ed Sullivan Show. Hey, if you're a fan of Van Halen, this video is for you. So it was a week or two back, we put out a video that talked about that very first Van Halen tour when they were opening up for Black Sabbath and how they were kind of blowing Black Sabbath off the stage every night and the kind of tumultuous position that Black Sabbath was in the moment. And we went back and we found a newspaper article or two talking about that time period. And so I thought it'd be kind of interesting after that to then take a look at the next tour. So something really interesting happened while I was doing research. So I found a concert review of Van Halen playing at the Lakeland Civic Center, and it was March 23rd of 1979. So it was on the Van Halen II tour, which is the album I have out right here. So I'm looking at that concert review, and as I'm going through a few different things in that paper, I find a concert review for Van Halen in the same paper a year later, playing at the same place. And then I find another concert review for Van Halen in the same newspaper in the same place a year after that. So in other words, I have 3 concert reviews from the same newspaper on 3 sequential tours of Van Halen. So we have, of course, just to put it in context, we have Van Halen II, we have the next one, which was Women and Children First, and then the one after that, which is Fair Warning. And so I have a concert review from one in 1979, one in 1980, and one in 1981 on these 3 different tours. Same newspaper, 3 different concert reviews. And so anyway, if you like Van Halen, I really think you're going to enjoy listening to what these people had to say after going to see him in concert. Now, what makes this especially interesting for a guy like me was because this concert, 3 sequential years, was in this place called the Lakeland Civic Center, which from what I understand is now called I wrote it down here, the RP Funding Center, is that this is the place where Ace Frehley in 1976 almost got electrocuted, which basically triggered him writing the song Shock Me. So anyway, this is that same place just a few years later with Van Halen. Okay, so the first one was on the Van Halen II tour. Van Halen II came out March 23rd of 1979, and this particular concert was on July 8th of 1979. So this is just April, May, June, July. So 4 months after the album comes out, they're playing in Lakeland, Florida, and then this article from it's the St. Petersburg Times. Each one of these is from the St. Petersburg Times. And I don't know because it says St. Petersburg Times and Tampa Bay Times. Each one of these newspapers say both of them. I don't know. Maybe they're the same newspaper, but each of these newspapers say Tampa Bay Times, St. Petersburg Times. So it's all the same newspaper. All right. So this review is written on July 10th of 1979. The concert was on July 8th of 1979. And the band that opened up for him, just by the way, is a band called Screams, which kind of just came, they were only around for an album or two, and then they were kind of gone. But anyway, that was the band that opened up for him here. All right, so this concert review, Van Halen concert was irresistibly entertaining. So again, we are on just to have this all in context, we're on the Van Halen II tour. This is their headlining now. As you know, the first tour, they were an opening act, opening up for a large part of that tour for Black Sabbath. All right. Lakeland, half-empty parking lots, deserted snack bars, weird. After all, Sunday's sellout was secured a week early. Yet showtime at the 10,000 capacity Lakeland Civic Center found a mere smattering on hand to greet white-hot pop rockers Van Halen as the California Quartet made its first local headline appearance. Actually, 6,000 wildly impressed listeners can't really be called a smattering, but by printing 4,000 more ducats, Van Halen's management could have collected another $32,000 or so at almost no extra overhead and still have complied with fire safety laws. Now, this is interesting. So did you hear that? This place, apparently, at the time at least, held 10,000 seats, 10,000 people, but they only sold 6,000 concerts. They had 4,000 empty seats. And so anyway, and they explain why in a second. I thought this was kind of fascinating. Besides, one reason for touring is to expose a band to as many potential record buyers as possible. Why limit the crowd so? And this is also an important thing. Back then, concert tickets were not that expensive, and part of the reason was they were going on concerts. They would go to do these tours to sell albums. The concerts weren't necessarily a big profit center for them. It was mainly for exposure so they could sell records. Today, the world's so different. You have these outrageous prices, and partly because you don't sell physical items like you used to back then. So anyway, it was kind of a different mentality from a concert, from a touring standpoint back then. Okay, one backstager offered a simple theory. This tour, a worldwide 10-monther that began in April, has to be a total sellout everywhere, which is kind of an interesting way to look at it. So if you don't open up the entire thing and you only have so many seats available, then you can sell it out. But drummer Alex Van Halen offered a more plausible explanation. Hang on just a second, this will be really quick. With hundreds of videos on our channel now, we've made playlists to make it easy for you to find whatever the thing is that you're interested in. We have a playlist with all of our Rush videos, Kiss, Led Zeppelin, Van Halen. We have categories like 80s metal and even our popular magazine flip-throughs, where we go through page by page with Circus Magazine, Hit Parader, and others, all in 4K resolution. You'll find it all organized and ready to explore. Just click the playlist tab on our channel's homepage. All right, back to the video. And gave comforting evidence that the rock and roll business isn't all greed and contempt. Says the fiery stick man, when you pack a place to the limit, there's always going to be a bunch of people way in the back or somewhere else they don't, or somewhere else they don't like. We don't want anybody to leave our show without having a great time. So anyway, so you have two different theories there. One of them is like, well, if you sell fewer tickets, it's easier to sell out. And then Alex Van Halen says, well, actually, we want everybody to have a good time, so if we sell seats too far away from the stage, people will leave without enjoying themselves. So anyway, do with that whatever you want to, but I thought that was kind of interesting, a little kind of an interesting dialogue there. Okay, the superb strategy recouped, musically and visually, what it might have lost financially. The fun-loving athletes of Van Halen generated more excitement Sunday night with 6,000 fans than Bad Company seemed to evoke from a truly packed house Friday. Our theory is that there's a little Van Halen in everybody, Alex explained, as his dark hair dripped dry from a post-concert shower. The entire band's attitude on and off stage is one of lovable cockiness. I love that line because does that not describe Van Halen? When you think about them, lovable cockiness. Anyway, I thought that was such a great way to describe them. While professional astonishment and their meteoric rise, they also exude the knowledge that they are hot. There will be no tampering with the technique, energy, enthusiasm, earthiness, and simplicity. The product, incandescent action, full of mighty leaps, whirlwind shrieks, and electrified slapstick. Alex and his brother Edward were born in the Netherlands, but have lived in suburban Los Angeles since childhood. Their band formed 5 years ago as Mammoth, but the name Van Halen somehow suited them. Among its more appropriate word associations, Van Allen, as in Van Allen belt up in the sky, Halley, as in Halley's Comet, even farther out there, and Halo, somewhat askew, of course. Being thoroughly prepared for tedium, I'd seen Van Halen twice before and considered them flashy but insubstantial, I found their headline debut to be stunningly magnetic, irresistibly entertaining. And that's an important bit of context from this guy, because so many times when we read these concert reviews, you get the impression that these people, that the editor said, hey, will you go to this concert and do a review on this band? And then they begrudgingly go see some band that they have no interest in at all. And then, of course, they write these horrible things about them. But in this case, this writer's actually seen him a couple times and kind of gives him a fair assessment. I guess the first couple times he saw him was as an opening band, and he's like, yeah, they're flashy, but I don't think there's much to them. But this time he says, you know what? This was actually really, really entertaining. Stunningly magnetic, irresistibly entertaining. Okay, classic poses, acrobatic leaps, waist-long blonde hair, a distinctively rangy voice, and one of the best conditioned bodies in showbiz make David Lee Roth a compelling focal figure. And I want to comment on this, and I really want to hear what you have to say about this. One of the things that I love about David Lee Roth, even though he's a little bit obnoxious, I mean, when you watch him in interviews, he's super entertaining, but it's almost just too much. But he's great. But he obviously is great in concert. I've seen Van Halen a few times, and I always enjoy him. But you got to hand it to him for one thing. He takes care of himself like nobody else does. And one of the things that I find a little bit kind of off-putting is how many times I've gone to see bands in the later years, and they just kind of let themselves go. And that is a choice. And David Lee Roth understands something. He goes, he understands he's an entertainer. And his visual, the way he looks, the way he presents himself matters. And there's so many bands I've seen that they just let themselves go and they start looking sloppy. And it just takes away from some of the magic. And even though David Lee Roth, of course, he's like an older guy now, but still, he has this great presence. And you look at people like Mick Jagger, and some of these other guys that have really gone out of their way to take care of themselves physically. And all I can say is that when I go see these people in concert and you can see that they've taken care of themselves, I enjoy it more. I take them more seriously. It's like these guys take their role as an entertainer. It's like they take it more seriously somehow. And you got to hand it. Do whatever you want to with David Lee Roth, but he has always known how to present himself physically. He's in great shape. He looks cool, and even as an older man now, he just still has something. He's got that X factor. He has that charisma, and part of it is because he knows how to physically present himself. So anyway, just a side note, a compelling focal figure. They say that about him here, and amazingly, even though he doesn't have the long blonde hair and he doesn't look like a young stud like he used to, he still looks cool. Okay. When not piercing the air with his unique shrill phrase endings, Roth acts as chief cheerleader and jester for his colleagues. Edward Van Halen, for my money, is as interesting a lead guitarist as Tom Scholz from Boston or any of the rising generation of Jimi Hendrix, Jeff Beck, Jimmy Page, and Keith Richards' disciples. His feedback never falters. His chime-like delicacies never misfire. His crazed leaps up the walls of amps never fail to remind us that great rock music must be fun, super tight, and never pompous. I love what this guy has to say. And that, to me, is so important. Great rock music must be fun, super tight, and never pompous. You want to destroy rock music, make it pompous. Rock music is at its best when you're having fun with it. And when it's tight enough that it makes you feel like moving. And then when it's not taking itself, even when it's serious, it's not taking itself too seriously. I mean, you look at a band like Iron Maiden, and their music, I mean, you listen to their music, and it's deadly serious music. But you see them in concert, you see the footage of everything they do, and there is a little bit of tongue-in-cheek in everything they do. They're having fun with the music. It's an enjoyable experience. And even though the music really, in some cases, has a message and it's a little bit dark, and it's entertaining. And one way or another, you're having fun with it. And that's such an important thing. It must be fun, super tight, and never pompous. Love that statement. Love it. And I think that's true across the board. Okay, another lovable touch. Van Halen didn't feel compelled to crank up the volume to eardrum-busting strength, yet the group's sound rang loud and clear. That's kind of an important thing, too. Just as a side note, I mean, how many times have you been to a concert where, even as a kid, where you're like, you know what? This is just a little too much, where you're just listening to it and it almost hurts. And you go, I'm having a hard time fully enjoying this because it's so loud that I just don't even, that it's a little bit off-putting to me. So anyway, that's just a little thing. And I'm an older guy now, but there were times when I was a kid, I'm like, holy cow, can we just I like it loud, but just a little bit off the edge. Anyway, Muscle Man bassist Michael Anthony bounces as furiously as his pals. He plays with his fist on occasion, but his finger work reminds us that his musical roots, like the Van Halens, are serious ones. Quote, I might even get to play some keyboards on the next album, Anthony confides after the show, but we aren't going to change the music, the basic Van Halen sound. And then he says they shouldn't. Okay, love that. I love that article. That was so cool. So that was the tour on Van Halen 2, their first headlining tour. And there's a picture of the guys. They must have taken these at the concert. There's David Lee Roth of Van Halen, it says. And then here we have a shot. Van Halen was stunningly magnetic at the Lakeland concert Sunday. Okay, moving on to the next article. Of course, the next album was Women and Children First, which came out on March 26th of 1980. And this next review also, Tampa Bay Times. This is November 15th of 1980. And so to put this one in context, the concert that they played in Lakeland at the Lakeland Civic Center was this day on November 15th of 1980. And this particular person writing the review had seen them the night before at the Bayfront Center Arena. And so they were playing in Lakeland this night when he wrote this article. And since he'd seen them the night before, he was writing a review of the concert that was basically going to happen that night at the Lakeland Civic Center. Now, an interesting thing about this particular tour, the opening band on these dates was a band called Talus. And who was the bass player for Talus? Billy Sheehan. And of course, Billy Sheehan, many years later, would be David Lee Roth's. When he was a solo artist and put out Eat 'Em and Smile, Billy Sheehan was the bass player. So just kind of an interesting connection right here that Talus was actually opening up for Van Halen, and many years later, David Lee Roth and Billy Sheehan would end up working together and have basically quite a bit of success there. Eat 'Em and Smile was huge. So, all right, so here we go. So this review of here we are, Women and Children First tour, and this review, again, in the Tampa Bay Times, is a little bit different than the other review we just read. So check this out. Van Halen, a heady dose of heavy metal that blitzed the Bayfront. Van Halen is not the name of a distinguished actor. It is not the latest British sports car. Van Halen is the last name of musician brothers Alex and Eddie. Van Halen is also the collective title of Alex and Eddie's rock band, finishing their 1980 American tour this weekend with shows in the Bay Area. Van Halen, among other things, is not for the squeamish. Heavy metal rock music has always appealed to a very slim audience. And it's so difficult these days for me to even use that word in reference to so many different, Van Halen. But at the time, they were. All the research that I do for this channel, I've actually even seen people reference Journey as heavy metal. So at the time, that term had become such a blanket for so many different styles of music. But it's just interesting. Again, you have to put yourself in the times of 1980, and Van Halen was seen as a heavy metal band. All right, traditionally, heavy metal groups like Van Halen flaunt a certain mixture of flash power and naughtiness that suffices for anger and rebellion in American teenagers who substitute the raised middle finger pose for real hostility. Heavy metal music has never been any more substantial than a security blanket for young people. In the case of Van Halen, their concert performance was neither better nor worse than the acts that filled the void in previous years. They're simply a loud, moronic, bubblegum band. They're not the first, and they certainly won't be the last. Alex Van Halen plays 2 drum sets at once. His showy solos, theatrically thunderous, with help from lots of echo, were abetted by a light show that would have looked better behind leaping fountains. Ed Van Halen, one of the more expressive guitarists in rock, performed non-stop, shrill guitar solos at every turn. Bass player Mike Anthony, who looks too old for this kind of posing, jumped up and down and just acted stupid. And I love the fact that they say that he looks too old. It is interesting because when I first became acquainted with Van Halen, Michael Anthony did kind of, you have the other 3, and he does kind of stand out. Like, how does he fit in with this group? But what's so at the time when I was a kid, it didn't kind of make sense to me. But the older I got and the older I get, the more I love Michael Anthony. He's just the coolest guy. And you look back and you go, you know what? Of all the guys in that band, the one I'd probably most likely just like to hang out with is probably Michael Anthony. Anyway, I love that guy. And he was when you read Ted Templeman's book about working with Van Halen all those years, he has nothing bad to say about Michael Anthony. He's like, you know what? That guy was just rock solid, always gave me exactly what I wanted, easy to deal with, just the most awesome dude. Anyway, so I love Michael Anthony. All right. Speaking of posing and acting stupid, David Lee Roth, Van Halen's lead singer, is a master at both. His voice is both abrasive and shrill, without a shred of tone or color, and his stage demeanor is that of heavy metal's everyman. He struts, leaps, tries to look lewd, and always keeps the limelight to himself. Well, always tries to keep limelight to himself. Yeah, I don't think that's even true, but he is definitely an attention. A guy that likes attention. Roth's between songs patter consisted of screaming, goading the crowd into screaming, and carefully cultivating the bad boy image the group wants to sell. Because the crowd really wanted to believe that it was real and it wasn't just textbook pablum. They ate it up. There's nothing wrong with that. Heavy metal music, no matter how oafish and nonsensical, is a rock and roll fantasy that its listeners have every right to experience. Now, you have to, again, put these things in the context of the time. This is 1980. I mean, Black Sabbath is like, what, a decade old? And so many of these people that are the writers of these newspapers, if we have to give them a little bit of grace in these cases, because, you know, if this is like a 35-year-old guy, he kind of caught rock and roll with the Beatles and where it had come since then. And so this was kind of new in a way for a lot of these people. So anyway, whatever. But they obviously didn't get it. So, all right. Listeners have every right to experience. Van Halen is merely this year's model. And if they can absorb the aggression and the adulation that has to go someplace, better a Van Halen concert than prison or the Moonies. And that's actually, just to say one other thing, that's actually kind of an important thing to think about. You know, the guy's sitting here making an observation, goes, look, I don't like this music at all. But you got a bunch of these crazy kids that have all this energy and they need an outlet for some of it. And if you're going to give them a place to have an outlet, it's better that it happens at a Van Halen concert rather than them out causing trouble that puts them in jail or joining a religious cult. This is, of those things, going to a Van Halen concert and letting loose, I guess, isn't all that bad when you compare it to all the other things that they could be doing right now. So it's a good outlet. And there's really something to be said about that. You know, I look back at when I was a kid, and it was something really, and I'd love to hear your feedback on this, because I think a lot of people can probably relate to this, having had conversations with people about this over the years. There was something to that. You know, this music was, in some weird way, was a friend to you. It was an outlet. Being able to go to your bedroom in some difficult days and in challenging times and be able to just get lost in some of that, just the loud, obnoxious, abrasive, heavy music. It was a release. And to be able to go to some of these concerts, and in my case, and I know with a lot of you too, to be able to play an instrument, to be able to pick up your guitar and then just play this heavy stuff and just kind of let it out. There was really something to that. And so for parents that recognized that, it was a blessing for them and for the kids that they could see that there was something, that there was some benefit to this music because it provided that outlet that they needed. Anyway, just a little side note there. And it'd be interesting to get your feedback on that as well. Okay, the group's sound system was crystal clear, albeit very loud, and their actual sound works better when combined with their considerable onstage visuals. Like so many other heavy metal bands on their records, Van Halen sound like a pointless mess. That's like so many other heavy metal bands on their records, Van Halen sound like a pointless mess. This is, again, somebody that just doesn't get it. And I mean that they should be able to, because you go listen to these albums. You have three albums now. Van Halen 1 is produced so well. I mean, even if you don't like the music, I can't even imagine somebody listening to it and not being able to say, you know what, that stuff's put together pretty well. And this is an unusually talented, at least Eddie Van Halen, just to be able to hand it to him saying, I don't necessarily like this style of music, but this is produced well and it sounds good. And you just go to each album with Ted Templeman at the helm, and that's what you've got. So to hear this, it's almost like, did you really listen to the records? If you really listen to it, calling it a pointless mess, I don't know. I mean, because even for me, I listen to some things that I don't like, and I can sit there and at least go, yeah, I don't like it, but I get it. I mean, I can see why people would enjoy this, and I can hear that it's produced well, it sounds good, the players are talented. I mean, I can hear that stuff even if I don't like the music. And this guy, anyway. All right, Van Nugent, Van Sabbath, Black Halen, Deep Halen, Judas Halen, AC Van DC. Heavy metal has never changed, will never change. As long as there are new recruits to the ranks of logo-crazy, show rock fans who only want a good time, there will always be a Van Halen. And that, in the grand scheme of things, I think you could not be much more wrong as time has told with the band Van Halen. It's interesting, just from my own little world doing this channel, whenever we put a Van Halen video out, people always watch it. Why? Because people love Van Halen. They have stood the test of time, unlike a lot of bands. They just, for whatever reason, and in some ways, they've been able to cross generations. Because when I talk to younger people, like here in the studio, I hire a lot of people that are half my age or even more than, even younger than that. And inevitably, I end up talking about, old music and things because we have the huge record collection, and I'm always talking about this stuff and trying to educate the young kids on good music. But when you start listing off bands like Rat, which I love, none of the kids know who Rat is. They've never heard that name before, and you can just go down the list, all these different bands they've never heard of. But I'll tell you what, you say Led Zeppelin, they've heard of Led Zeppelin. You say Black Sabbath, they've usually heard of Black Sabbath. And you say Van Halen, they've heard of Van Halen. So somehow, some of these bands, and this is one of them, that when this guy just kind of dismisses them and says, it's just the flavor of the month, it'll be gone, and the next one will come in. That may have been true to some degree, but Van Halen was different because they managed to somehow stand the test of time in a way that a lot of bands simply haven't been able to. There was something really special about them. Okay, last one. So we just did Women and Children first. This was the tour in 1981 where we have Fair Warning. And so in this case, the Fair Warning came out in 1981, April 29th of 1981. But this concert was August 19th of 1981, and this review is being written on August 21st of 1981. Same, again, like I said at the beginning, same newspaper, Lakeland, Florida. And this one, they'd played the Lakeland Civic Center the night before, or 2 nights before, and now he's writing this article. Now, this one is kind of interesting, too, because the band that opened up in this case is a band called G-Force, which I could not really say anything intelligent about, except for the fact that it was put together by Gary Moore. Gary Moore, of course, who'd played with Thin Lizzy, and he, I guess, had moved to L.A., and then he'd put this band together that was called G-Force. All right, so then the title... opinion section, Van Halen uncorks it at Lakeland. And here we go. So this is August 21st, 1981. Lakeland. A concert by heavy metal group Van Halen brings every parent's nightmare about rock music to life. Thousands of bleary-eyed kids in jeans and various rock group t-shirts openly passing marijuana joints, even water pipes, after priming themselves with liquor in the Civic Center parking lot. A half hour before the show starts, there are already casualties lying on the floor of the Civic Center. One motionless, nauseated young man unfortunately didn't make it to the restroom. David Lee Roth, Van Halen's lead singer, drinks from a liquor bottle on stage. He exhorts the audience to party and describes what Van Halen was doing before they came on stage. Quote, "Me and the rest of the band was sitting backstage getting real effed up," Roth says, and the crowd cheers. Roth ventures far beyond sexual suggestion in his physical performance. His shiny black and red pants tightly sheathe his lower torso, and as for his motions, well, he never would have made it onto the Ed Sullivan Show. That's so funny. And it is funny contextually, again, when you put it, this is 1981. I mean, you're literally 12 years outside of the 60s when he's writing this thing. So that all that stuff was not that far back, and not that far back. You had Elvis Presley, who was being, to us today, this was 50, 60 years ago. To them, just a few decades. Well, it really wasn't as far back where you had Elvis kind of pushing the boundaries, and and this is so much worse than Elvis, of course. 40 speakers are suspended from the Civic Center rafters, and there must have been 75 more amplifiers forming the stage backdrop. The sound, remarkably crisp, is nevertheless quite loud. In short, heaven for the predominantly 12 to 20-year-old crowd. But it must have looked like the twilight of civilization to the group of middle-aged Lakeland parents reconnoitering the concert. The members of the local organization that has been increasingly concerned about liquor and drug use at Civic Center rock concerts. For young adherents of heavy metal music, Van Halen's is doubtless a satisfying performance. Even people who prefer music with their this is great. Even people who prefer music with their noise can appreciate some of the energy, effort, and production touches that go into a Van Halen show. Lewdness aside, the well-muscled Roth is an eye-catching figure on stage, his long blonde lion's mane trailing behind him as he athletically leaps, prances, and dashes about the elongated stage. And it's pretty fascinating. I know I mentioned this before, but he did such a great job taking care of himself. And he just always, like it or not, he just looked cool. He was in great shape. He was a good-looking dude, that long blonde hair. And this would be an interesting discussion to have sometime, but when you look at the 1980s and all these different singers that came along, who was it that they were really trying to be? Because when you look back at the previous decade, you had Robert Plant and you had David Lee Roth. And it seems like so many of these singers that we were introduced to that became popular throughout the 80s seem like they were, in many ways, creating a combination. Elements of Robert Plant, elements of David Lee Roth, creating their own version of that stuff. But it seemed like everybody that hit through the 80s, and probably way beyond that, had elements, little bits and pieces of those guys really influenced all the stuff that would come after that. And so I mentioned that because he really did. These people mention this. He was an eye-catching figure on stage. Yeah, there was something about him. You want to talk about an X factor? He just had this thing that people responded to. He was such a great showman, such a great performer, and he just looked cool. So athletic leaps, prances, dashes about the elongated stage. He yells rather than sings, but it's an impressive, full-bodied howl that is appropriate to the simple-minded lyrics and structure of the group's songs. Now, I'm going to push back on this. And Ted Templeman talks about this book in his book, and so does Alex Van Halen in Brothers. They mention the fact that we don't give David Lee Roth nearly enough credit for the lyrics that he wrote for some of these tunes. They really were, and I never thought about it until I read those books. And then you start listening to it, and you go, these were these really great little just touches of brilliance that were these sneak peeks into real life, into real people, and had almost this street wisdom in David Lee Roth's lyrics. He was actually really good at it. And we just don't, at least I never did, gave him enough credit for it. And then you start reading some of these people in these books and you go, you know what? There really was something. He was a lot deeper than people ever gave him credit for. And it's funny because then you watch what he did throughout his life after this, setting aside the albums. He did so many things with his life. He really is kind of an interesting character in a lot of other ways besides just being a singer for a band. And so you can kind of see that his mind is in a different place where he can actually write these interesting little useful philosophical statements in these simplistic lyrics that he'd write. Anyway, just whatever. Okay. A more likable onstage figure is Eddie Van Halen, who has a bemused elfin charm that distinguishes him from the stereotypical swaggering guitar hero. And also, again, just a quick side note, and I'd love to hear your feedback on this. One of the things that you always notice about Eddie Van Halen when he's playing live, the dude just had a huge smile on his face all the time. Whatever the song was, it was just fun watching him, and you could just tell he was having a blast. He was having a ball. Got this huge grin on his face. Even if it's a serious song, he just looks like it's just fun. And so when it says it here, this bemused elfin charm, he did just have this kind of this inviting way about him when you'd see him playing. Okay, and then they mention his clothes here, wearing striped socks and knickers, and we've all seen pictures, obviously, of that look that he had at the time. He appeared to be a fine guitar player, although his prolonged solo near the end of the show broke little new ground. He has speedy fingers and can make his instrument sound like a synthesizer one minute and a spaceship the next. But it seemed like empty doodling around rather than an impressive statement. The band closed its set with the Kinks' You Really Got Me, and with Van Halen's reputation as a guitar virtuoso, one would expect some sparks to fly. But Dave Davies has nothing to worry about. And that, it's kind of funny. I mean, so many of us were introduced to Van Halen with the song, of course, You Really Got Me, their cover song of the old Kinks tune. And of course, Eddie Van Halen, you hear him playing, you go, what in the world is going on here? Because he's just, he's amazing, right? Especially at the time. What is this? But it's interesting, since they mentioned Dave Davies, and I know they're totally different things, but when you go back and listen to him, I'm going to jump to a different song, but it's a similar one, All Day and All the Night. When you listen to the guitar execution on that song, especially the solo, it is so raw and obnoxious. And when he says here, Dave Davies has nothing to worry about, I mean, the two guitar players are not even in the same, they're operating in different universes. But there really is some beauty to that 60s kind of raunchy, whatever. When you listen, especially go listen to the solo for All Day and All the Night from the Kinks, it is just this raw energy. There's no precision, there's none of that stuff like we got so used to in the 80s. It's just like this, just banging it out. It's so great. I love that raw energy that so many of those guys are doing way back when. Okay, anyway, just since they mentioned Dave Davies, I just had to say something. Okay, both bass guitarist Michael Anthony and drummer Alex Van Halen, who plays an enormous drum kit, actually two sets combined, also had long solos. The lighting Wednesday night was the most impressive since the Bruce Springsteen shows last February. Van Halen's is a broader lighting scheme, much busier and flashier, but it fit the music as perfectly as Springsteen's more subtle lighting scheme fit his. The obvious thinking that has gone into the showcasing of Van Halen's concert makes an evening with them more enjoyable than the legions of heavy metal practitioners one tier below. And it's such an important thing that just to note this. When you think about these musicians, so many of these guys, and Van Halen understood it, and you can just go down the list of all the bands that really got it. When people come to see the concert, they want a show. They're coming to be entertained. And so they really understood, look, it needs to sound good, it needs to look good. David Lee Roth understands that. I've got to be the master of ceremonies here. We've got to be fun and exciting and energetic, and we've got to have lights, and we've got, all the stuff, and they got it. And so the bands that really, really understood that, and you have these people like this that appreciate the fact that, look, these guys actually understand the importance that this is entertainment at its core. That's the point here. So anyway, just kind of an important thing to note there, and then this guy even notices it. The crowd response was uneven. The people near the stage were fairly active near the beginning of the show, and ovations met the group's better-known songs, Run With the Devil, Dance the Night Away. And there was the obligatory encore, but after a while, the crowd seemed curiously benumbed. And then that's the end of that article. Which is, by the way, an interesting thing, because I've actually had this conversation with some people, too, related to Van Halen. The first time I saw Van Halen was the 1984 tour. And I'll be honest with you, they looked bored on the stage. And it was a little bit weird to me because I was by 1984, I was a big fan. I mean, I've talked about them multiple times on this channel. Getting Diver Down, and then getting Van Halen II, and Women and Children First, and all this stuff, and then eventually just getting all their stuff and just loving Van Halen, all of it, and then going and seeing them in concert in 1984. It was a little bit for me, kind of a, It was cool to be able to see them, but I'm sitting there as whatever I was, 14 years old when I saw them, and I just remember thinking to myself, because I was fairly easily impressed because I was a young guy not having seen many concerts. And even so, I still watched that concert thinking, they look like they're bored. Like they've and that was kind of how it came across to me. So it's interesting seeing this, that by the time we got to this tour, this third concert review, this guy's noting that, as we got further into the concert, even the fans were looking a little bit like, And I don't know how true. Some people I've talked to say, they just were boring every time I saw them, and other people are like, no man, it was the greatest concert I ever saw. All I can tell you is my experience on that 1984 tour, which is the only time I ever saw them with David Lee Roth in that first vision. I saw him at the last tour with David Lee Roth, but I didn't. That's the only time I saw him in the original Van Halen. That's the impression I got with it. They were cool. They played well, I guess, and I loved Michael Anthony's bass solo. That was probably my favorite part. But it did feel like they were a little they were a little bored at the time. Anyway, I'd love to get your feedback on that too. Hey, I hope you enjoyed this. This was super fun for me doing this research and finding these things. Again, this was Lakeland, Florida. They played it 3 years in a row, and to have these concert reviews each year in the same newspaper when they played in Florida there, and then they each time had played in that same place. And so it's just a kind of a cool thing to read this stuff and see what people were thinking at the time and how they were responding to it. And love to get your feedback on all this stuff as usual. Hey, please follow the channel and like the video. Please leave any comments you have about this stuff. We really love hearing this stuff. We really appreciate hearing from you. And with that, have yourself a fantastic day.